All right. So just a little different as to where we're going in thinking about some of this. So I'm Roger, and I work for NOAA. There are some dramatic statements. We'll talk a little bit about this. I'm not going to get as much into the security question, but just say how it's shaping where we're going and where things like even the adaptation science paper, GCRP, and where we're thinking is drawing from our lessons and our experience. I'm going to talk about my experience in AGCI and how we've learned over time, and actually show some slides from previous meetings to show that we're building on the knowledge that's engaged here. As people have seen this before, I like to put this up. Someday we'll be able to say more than that. Experts say rainfall may lessen drought. So when we have more of an impact, right, that would be grand. So moving right along, here's some of the people that influenced me. If for those of you that are familiar with atmospheric chemistry, that guy is Harold Schiff, who got me into atmospheric sciences. Jack McConnell, who passed away last year, very brilliant scientist. Going from Herbert Real to this guy called Gilbert White. And there are a few characters in there that you might recognize. There's Margaret Davidson, Roger Barry, a few others. So I'm going to come back to how Mike Hall. The reason why I have Mike in there too is because one of the minds in terms of systematizing how science influences should be in the forefront of public service comes from these people. And it's the reason for putting that. We can talk about the ideas, but how we frame it in the context of services becomes really critical. So the way I look at it is this is a continuum between Herb Real, who once said one of the funniest things I've ever heard. We came out of a meeting. He was the father of modern tropical meteorology. He was called the father of floodplain management. Lots of dads. Herb came out of a meeting and said to me, I said, hey, Professor Real, what do you think about that talk? And he said, well, it's good to see old results in color. The idea is that it maps, and like Pink Floyd, goes from an idea. We were hiking in the Andes, and he goes to me, so why do you see these clouds, and how were they formed? And I said, we're hiking, it's a nice morning. The idea is what you can learn from the immediate experience, and how that translates back to large-scale circulation was a rich notion. This is why the local matters in the context of not simply looking at global circulation and saying how we move down. And then Gilbert, I'd see him every 2 months or so, and he'd sit me down, and he wouldn't want to know, oh, which academy panels were you on, what you'd written. He'd go, you doing anything useful? And this is real. You had to have an answer. Yeah. So it bridges some time scale, some ways of thinking, some ways of knowing, and streams of thought. So I'm going to point to how that influences and links to Richard's talk in a second. These are some of the things I've been involved in. Everybody in this room have been. There's a paper I wrote in 1997 with a guy named Bill Reebsame called The Political Ecology of Vulnerability to Hurricanes. So when I want to add someone to this continuum where Steve is very central, one of the reasons why I came to Boulder, there's this other character who's in the room here somewhere that played a big influence in the way we think through these processes, and a lot of why I got involved in some of these areas. So there's a continuum of people, of ideas, of ways of thinking that bridges the discipline, how deep one gets. I always tell students and otherwise, if you want to be multidisciplinary, learn method in your discipline, not simply read a little bit about something. The other. So this is quite the bridge from Gilbert to Herb back, and some very unique individuals in between, leading to a whole lot of tree killing. So there are also some other guys who've influenced what I do. Dr. Evil and Darth Meal, who sit right there. And they're the ones, I call them the tormentors. You have to have mentors. This is a tormentor. The idea, though, is their organizational capability of bringing groups like this together. It's why we show up. And we have to remember that. Who calls you to the table is really critical. And you show up. When Jerry had already been working for NCAR, and when we were students, it was a big deal. You go to see what Jerry was up to, right? Richard, huge influence in how we think in an integrated sense. But there are people who intervene to make sense and mediate with these folks, like Harry Katzenberger, who I'm here, who is really one of the people that really puts the wand out for these two guys and says, okay, hold on, let's make sense of this planet you keep talking about. So let's think about this. Big picture from SREX. What is our dissonance here in terms of discipline? We want to produce early warning, probabilistic risk assessments, but we also want to get at resilience, right? This is a bit of a dissonant way of looking at how we look at the problems. We want to produce parametric estimates because we can link them to our models and produce answers that create early warnings of where changes might occur and where societies might evolve. But there's also this broader thing called vulnerability that has not become truly an operational concept because it's too hard to get to. It's easy to identify in a sense of we've learned that society constructs risks. But really, how is that commensurate with the actions that we've taken? Not a great deal. And we have to keep that in mind. It's not that it's not a useful concept, it's how we link these two that become critical over time. So there's the special report on extremes. We know short-term actions do not always provide long-term risk reduction and can reduce or enable longer-term risk. Classic, the floodplain and the seashore, right? Ian Burton, Bob Cates, the levee effect. Bill actually referred to that in one of the papers. For exposed and vulnerable communities, and you heard this, even non-extreme weather and climate events can have extreme impact. The accumulation and morbidity of risk is as important as getting the single event. And this has turned out to be a really, really important thing in development. When I deal with the World Bank and other folks, you know, the lessons are that we think we can manage the PDF, the middle of the PDF, when in fact, the entire sequences of events are themselves extremes. And that becomes a question about how do we then understand the science behind that. There are hidden risks. Most estimates of losses include the indirect losses. People in this room know that. Livelihoods, informal economies, intangible losses. But in the rush to quantification, we kind of drop these off in many cases. And so we have to say, where do we come back to this? We have a lot of areas in which we're seeing surprises in the system. We constantly think, I think I mentioned the first day, we constantly think of high elevation, sea level rise, or the sea ice margin. But in the semi-arid margins around the world, we're seeing very rapid changes that are the result of this. But for the most part, when we talk about adaptation and we talk about recommendations to adapt, we have not actually done the evaluations and appraisals of those adaptation practices. They themselves carry a great deal of uncertainty. One of the things we always talk about, what's one of the major ways of adapting in the West? Interbasin transfer. What happens when both basins are drying, the one you're transferring from as well? That's happening right now in California, right? You have the lower Colorado, meat is at its lowest level, Southern California is in deep drought, right? So the place you draw from itself. So our adaptations themselves carry their own vulnerabilities over time. So I'm going to talk about a few things I was involved in. An assessment with Carl Walters, and people know that name. Carl Walters and Buzz Holling came up with the phrase adaptive management in the mid-70s, and 1986 they wrote a classic book. John hosted a meeting here for us in which we looked at the adaptive management projects in the Pacific Northwest and the Colorado Basin and did a comparison on what's being learned from those. There's the successes, they're in red. There's the modeling failures. In fact, where we couldn't get all the information, where he couldn't, because we were assessing a bunch of them around the world. There's the implementation failures, easier to spot. So the question becomes, even when we have modeling successes, implementation somehow falls apart, right? As people know, there's a famous study, I think it was by Baruch Fischoff, that basically showed in the siting of the Shoreham nuclear plant, the people that estimated the risk of an accident and were against the plant, and the people that estimated the risk of an accident and were for the plant, both estimated the risk of an accident at the same number. What does that tell us? It tells us something else drives us in the context of looking at risk over time. Here's a bunch of studies we looked at fairly recently on where are people doing what they're calling climate risk management. What are the things that go into that vertically in each of these locations? These aren't representing countries. These are projects carried out by teams in those areas. And then something that we just finished, 21 cases around the world on how early warning information system is trying to address cross-time scale conditions. The idea of assessing these and the methodologies behind them are themselves of interest, right? How do we know change is happening, projects are in place, how is implementation and evaluation taking place? Well, what is it that we learn from this? Stuff people already in the room know. Most action follows focusing events. Something has to happen to wake us up. As I said yesterday, we're really good at responding to events. We're not as good as responding to information about events. That characterizes a whole slew of areas in how we do national assessments. Leadership at different levels and the public are engaged. Without that, we don't see action. If there's not a framework for collaboration between research and management, we do not get long-lasting action. And that is critical to all of us, right? And the idea that we move beyond the projects. And there has to be a social basis for why we're acting. Equity is critical, always. Both distributional and procedural, the way in which people take part. Growth, we're not going to get away from saying, hey, let's not talk about growth. I was in a meeting with the in Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint, probably the most contentious watershed in the US. And the governor of Georgia, who shall remain nameless, said to me, oh, okay, all right, Atlanta, well, I know it's getting big. Let's not talk about growth, but let's solve this water scarcity problem. That was actually the phrase, right? So there's things that we're sort of background in this setting. I always like to tell people, when they say, let's be proactive, I always tell them, yeah, you first. Right? Because it's easy to frame things in a proactive setting when you don't bear the responsibility for the outcomes. Right? You send it back to me. If I'm in big trouble, I revise the paper and resubmit. I don't go, ooh, I lowered the reservoir. What do I do? Right? So there's a mad rush to the Trans-ition Express. Anybody remember Kraftwerk? See, I have a few heads nodding. So in this mad rush to the Trans-ition Express, we know the demand for climate information is increasing. You ever remember Kraftwerk, Bill?
No.
What?
More than
William!
half of us are lost.
Well, the fact that this room is lost on some of it doesn't mean it's obscure. The idea, just a joke.
Carry on.
Carry on, Roger. This is coming out of your tank.
So we know, right? We've been able to identify where the local to the national, the weekly to the decadal, what the different kinds of information needs are. How we're filling them and how we construct those information needs become really critical. So I'm going to mention now a few things I've been involved in helping create to actually address those. Thank you. Peace, man. So the idea, there's the National Integrated Drought Information System, Regional Integrated Sciences, and some people know some of these. I've played a hand in developing them, Richard, a whole host of others, the Caribbean Community Climate Center. And so we look at how integrated approaches, and this is from the California RISA, take into account the many changes on landscapes that we're seeing. But what is it that we're learning? We're learning to inform decisions at the national, regional, and local level. As other people in this room who've done congressional hearings know, they're hearings, they're not listenings. There's quite a difference. There's quite a difference, right? That in fact you're there to make sure you're reinforcing something someone wants to hear. In building this and getting at all of these issues, the networks, the partnerships with the governors, there's Tom Vilsack, the head of agriculture. It was Nancy Sutley previously from OSTP and elsewhere. March 2014, March 2013, describing products that we provide to them, to the entire array of national governors around the country. That's to whom they're speaking. I'm not talking to them. These are products that we've provided to their staff and their people on how to describe the case, a mixed portfolio of approaches, right, in terms of communication. So what did we get from this? We get a reauthorization and, more importantly, an appropriations. So in 2014, passed 369 to 21 in the House, a climate-related bill. For all of the things we've been hearing about, whoa, we can't get that done in Congress, we have to ask, how do some things get done over others? And so I've had to do a lot of backroom stuff on this, but the idea is this. Today I signed the NIDIS reauthorization. The president right there, I was in the room when he did it, this whole deal, but to then get Congress to say we're appropriating a budget to that, and it's a climate-related question. That's something we can talk about if you ever want to deal with this. So if it's so easy to do, why is it so hard? There's the Dreadnought class ship, meet the Borg. What makes it so hard? Strong risk of underestimating the complexity of adaptation. We're really good at that. We have good recommendations, we don't know how they work. Increasing recognition of adaptation buffers, but most critically, the lack of coordination and implementation across the scales of governance. We reify the local. Everything happens locally. I love the local. Well, guess what? At the local level, you also have elites. You also have people that come to the fore. This is why you need standards of practice that are larger than the local, at the regional, at the watershed, and at the local level. So this is a slide from a previous talk that somebody gave here. There's the Summer of Love. There's Watergate. The year is 2014. We are closer to 450 parts per million and 9 billion people than to either of these. It's just a way of thinking about, it's the old saying, hurry, the lemmings are gaining, right? So the idea is how to think through the fact that this is in our future in shorter terms than our memory. This is a cognitive problem. So to craft adaptation, why is it hard? The cumulative impacts of hazards. The system may change faster than we can recalibrate. I'm almost there. Proactive decision making. We talk a lot about co-production, but co-production is fraught with portent. That was from a Bullwinkle cartoon when he just, yeah. He said, Rocky said, is the news bad? He said, it's fraught with portent. And he said, it's that bad? He said, no, this is Jim Ford and Peter Portent. They're talking to each other on the news. Okay, so the idea is, what is co-production? Working together. But when we co-produce with a self-selected technological group. We create advocacy without knowing it. And I could tell you the cases in which this has happened, in which we're actually advancing one group agenda over the other. And so we need, it's not that it's a bad idea, it's something we need to be aware of. Right? Information use can be a symbolic commitment. People ask you for information because it looks rational. That doesn't mean it's used or applied. Win-win is not always easy to implement in practice. As the old saying goes, if there's a win-win situation, the loser is not at the table or is on the menu. Right? So, this is a slide from Darth Meal that I like to use. What do we need to do? Acknowledge the cross-scale nature of climate. We're still not there yet. We're still talking about change somewhere into the future. And as Bill constantly reminds me, what makes you think that saying that we will plan for the future when we are not actively planning for extreme events and surprises in the present will happen? What makes us think that? So we have to approach climate model output a little more critically than at present. There are pathways to predictability. When I go into an area to work on an early warning system, this is how we approach it. Where are the anomalies? Where are the global changes? Where are the regional forces? And here's a research set of criteria on how to bring a problem orientation, which Jeff mentioned the first day, towards thinking about these questions. Recognize communication as critical, but not sufficient. More challenging is understanding the socialization of lessons that are learned. That is more challenging than understanding this of communication. And reframing risk governance. Basically, what should happen locally, what should happen nationally, what should happen at the regional level. So to end, how does learning take place? I'm not ending, it just gives Jay some optimism. How often? This is the fundamental adaptation criteria. How often should criteria for robustness be considered? Not what is robust, but how often should our assumptions be questioned? This is the critical question, because that's what happens in a changing environment. So if it's so easy, why is it so hard too? Resolutions, me, what are you trying to imply? I don't need to change. Well, buddy, as far as I'm concerned, I'm perfect the way I am. The need to change in light of new information is not widely acknowledged. We've learned for a long time that land use planning gives you back more dollars for every dollar invested than retrofitting, but our actions are not commensurate with knowing that. Yet we've known that for a long time. So NOAA, where are we going? Taking those ideas and trying to apply them in a cross-timescale concept. If you ask across NOAA, are we doing this? No, we're not. These are a set of efforts that we need people in the room engaged in. What is needed? Policy entrepreneurs. There's some of them that I work with on tribal lands. They do the work, right? Capacity and coordination, sustaining these folks, doing this for a long time. That approach ticks off the institutional people, because it says that no institution, however well designed, is independent of having talented, dedicated people at key nodes in the system. This is a mistake we constantly make. We think we can design institutions. So there's my slide. What do we want? Evidence-based change. This is a slide I took from Keith Dixon. When do we want it? After peer review. But let's not wait too long. I wanted to rehash this slide. I've showed it several times in the AGCI, but it's one of my favorites. It's the last time I'll show it. We have a lot of hubris. I like it, right? Richard loves it. Oh, all right. The cat is going, I recognize this problem. I've caught birds. They have claws, they have beaks. It's a bird. That's how we analyze our problems right now. The eagle is going, what the hell are you thinking? Right? That's an important distinction. It's not that this problem is so different. It's that we recognize parts of the problem and cognitively anchor on past solutions. This is what's important. So somebody's going to lose this fight, so there's an old saying, you know, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And why is that? Because anybody that says they are is not. Distrust claims of sustainability. Ask hard questions. There's the piece from, for whoever wants it, on what we added to the summary for policymakers on indigenous knowledge. Thank you very much.
So, Michael,
Time's up.
You should probably start.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Up.
Well, you know, I had to give some history as to the
Michael,
influence of
let's queuing
AGCI.
up. Michael,
Yeah,
let's
oh, sorry.
Let's grab one
Sorry.
question here,
Yeah.
or comment, or
That
I don't know what
took a lot of
it's
work.
comments.
Not
Go.
somebody wanted to see it.
I'm just curious if the drought legislation that
Yeah.
seems to be enjoying large bipartisan support
Yeah.
was described as climate-related impacts or more natural hazards or something else.
Okay, so here's a critical issue, right? We talk about framing, we talk about effective complexity. right? The work I've been doing with these folks on different meetings is let's say reclaiming the climate area as a cross-time scale problem. The moment I begin to tell them that this means ENSO, this means decadal, this means subseasonal, I can speak to them about climate. If I speak to them about climate change, remember Tom Carl talked about getting the kibosh. I was in the room with the head of the House Science and Technology Committee when he says, I have a third of my people who haven't bought into this. They have a litmus test. There's no way I'm selling this to them, even if I want to do it. So in getting the marketing, it wasn't so much, oh, we have drought. Obviously, they did something. But much more from the standpoint of, for the communities in which change was the issue, addressing change is how I addressed it. For the communities in which the experienced hazards were the issue, that's how you address it. You're not actually making up anything that's any different other than how we secure and pursue the common good. That they bought into. And 369 to 21 is pretty crazy, but I'll tell you where the 21 was, mostly in the southeast in the ACF basin. And the reason is, it's very interesting. If you think that it's all about climate change, the state climatologist for Georgia got fired 3 years ago for talking too much about drought. Not about climate change, because it implies a set of actions over time, right? And one of the good things about drought is it is embedded in the cumulative experience of people. You don't have to make up a multi-year event or a 10-year event. He was fired because of that.